Ilhan Omar walked onto the Fox News set ready to label JD Vance a prejudiced individual before he even spoke. The Ohio veteran observed a representative who was accused of marrying her own sibling to gain legal immigration standing. She had previously described the September 11th attackers as just individuals taking action and told crowds to doubt her citizenship. He showed up equipped with the official wedding documents she had avoided addressing for a very long time. This meeting was entirely never meant to unfold as a typical political discussion. It was constructed to serve as a severe moment of accountability. The network presented the broadcast as a conversation regarding border policies and assimilation, though all watchers comprehended the real hidden background. Over several years, serious allegations had spread about the Congresswoman that prominent media corporations just refused to thoroughly investigate. Reporters had previously rejected all questions as nothing more than baseless rumors or clear proof of discriminatory bias. Did she actually wed her sibling in 2009 to commit visa manipulation so he could get permanent residency? What caused her to downplay the worst violent attack on U.S. soil into a minor event involving folks doing things? In what exact way could a lawmaker making a standard government wage amass incredible wealth while directing massive donor funds to her husband's business? What made her share such clear anti-Jewish sentiments that her own political organization felt forced to officially condemn her actions on two separate occasions? Additionally, what prompted her to travel overseas and tell listeners to challenge our patriotic roots rather than boldly announcing her status as a U.S. leader? The Republican senator spent nearly a month getting ready for this confrontation, and he definitely did not waste his energy reading theoretical legislative documents. He held real municipal matrimony certificates from the Midwest proving the Congresswoman entered a legal union with that specific man during the winter of that year. He carried educational registration paperwork obtained by researchers in Africa that showed both individuals registered for school under the exact same maternal and paternal figures. He retained personal pictures posted online showing the two of them as children living in a shared residence before those digital files were intentionally deleted forever. He saved image captures of internet comments from her personal relatives calling the man her sibling in multiple languages prior to the large-scale account scrubbing. He kept financial filings gathered through proper channels showing she submitted combined tax paperwork with another partner while still legally bound to the first man. He possessed formal conclusions from the State Electoral Oversight Committee detailing her many different regulatory breaches. He brought video recordings covering each controversial statement she had spoken over the years. He gathered her legislative voting record, and everything was arranged, authenticated, and prepared to be broadcast on the giant television screens in the room. The events that unfolded when a deployed veteran honoring his sworn duties confronted an individual accused of cheating the naturalization process exposed an enormous hidden scandal. The defensive barrier of claiming religious discrimination that protected the lawmaker for so long completely failed against a military man holding verified written evidence. The television broadcasting room held several hundred audience members, and the overall mood felt intensely charged the moment the building entrances were finally opened up. The representative's tiny group of supporters gathered closely, donning traditional headscarves and holding placards about prejudice, looking bold but noticeably uncomfortable in the unfriendly environment. The rest of the observing crowd heavily favored the Ohioan, featuring a large amount of former armed forces personnel wearing their respective unit apparel. They showed up exclusively to watch a fellow service member pose the difficult queries that long-term elected officials remain too fearful to ever vocalize. The Congresswoman walked out initially, receiving light clapping from her followers and continuous deafening expressions of disapproval from the rest of the seated crowd. She dressed in a colorful head covering and an expensive outfit, projecting the strong confidence of a person who overcame controversies by calling them prejudiced attacks. She looked prepared to deploy her usual protective strategy, which argued all critiques were anti-Muslim bias, all documentation was forged, and all questioning was bigoted. She had refined this defensive shell throughout her half-decade in the legislature and assumed it would work perfectly in this setting just like before. She had disastrously misjudged the determination of JD Vance. The senator stepped onto the stage half a minute afterward, greeting a massive wave of cheering that lasted for almost a full 200 seconds. Approaching 40 years of age, maintaining the straight stance and short trim of his military days, he dressed in a basic, dark-colored professional outfit. He held a trio of thick folders, which he dropped beside his designated chair with an intentional loud noise that every person in attendance noticed. The physical difference between the two speakers was instant and highly noticeable. She looked exactly like an elected official ready to claim unfair treatment, whereas he appeared as a legal investigator showing up with undeniable factual proof. The network moderator started the event with typical comments regarding polite conversation and concentrating on core issues instead of launching direct individualized verbal attacks. That hopeful goal managed to last for roughly 120 seconds. Representative, we kindly ask that you deliver your initial introductory remarks now. The lawmaker used her practiced introduction, talking with that unique pronunciation her supporters considered genuine while her political opponents generally viewed it as deeply annoying. I appreciate it, moderator, since my presence this evening is necessary because particular people cannot handle a minority immigrant female holding office in our government. The aggressive complaints thrown my way are completely based on religious hatred and racial prejudice. These sentiments stem from folks who simply refuse to acknowledge that an individual with my appearance and my faith can truly belong to this nation. Regardless of the opposition, I refuse to keep quiet. Her dedicated followers applauded with intense excitement. She rested against her chair, looking highly pleased and remarkably self-assured. She had successfully built the ethical boundary that was intended to protect her position. The veteran stared in her direction with a facial reaction resting somewhere between genuine sadness and total disgust. As he began talking, his vocal tone held a minor regional cadence that proved he came from a blue-collar background rather than just faking it. Representative, my goal this evening is to examine facts, entirely avoiding guesses or rumors, focusing strictly on paperwork, files, and your personal spoken words. I plan to present straightforward inquiries to you that absolutely require simple affirmative or negative replies. He flipped open his initial folder, and the television screens lit up, displaying a document that caused the lawmaker to noticeably tense up her posture. The graphic showed a wedding certificate from the local Midwestern jurisdiction printed in early 2009, indicating she became legally bound to that specific man. We should start the discussion at this exact point. The legal union paperwork occupied all available monitors inside the room, completely formal and impossible to dispute. The Congresswoman's identity and the man's identity were linked in an official marital contract properly recorded by the state government located in the upper Midwest. The senator let the bright visual remain visible for an extended moment. The lack of noise grew intensely profound and deeply awkward. You traveled to the United States seeking asylum during the mid-90s. He started, keeping his voice casual but entirely uncompromising. You were just a preteen while your home country experienced total societal collapse, forcing your relatives to escape immediately. This republic welcomed you inside when your own government failed to ensure your survival, providing security, schooling, and a better future. In time, this nation made you a fully recognized resident and eventually voted you into the legislature to speak on behalf of the massive population. He briefly stopped speaking, letting that biographical context settle into the room prior to continuing his points. Therefore, we must talk about the specific individual you officially joined in matrimony during the second month of that particular year. The representative's complexion lost its color since she completely understood the direction of the inquiry and lacked any solid defensive responses. You established a legal union with him in the Midwestern city during that winter, and this remains a documented fact. Correct or incorrect? The lawmaker tried to pivot back to her practiced talking points, claiming her private romantic background was unfairly targeted by baseless gossip. Affirmative or negative, the veteran suddenly interjected, using his military bluntness to cut right through her obvious effort to avoid the question. Did you become the legal spouse of this particular individual on that exact winter day over a decade ago? She found it impossible to reject a certified municipal document currently broadcast on television for a massive audience to clearly observe. I concede that the wedding took place, but I am finished discussing it. Currently, I will show the audience exactly why countless citizens strongly suspect this specific man is actually your biological sibling. The large monitors transition to show aged educational registration documents originating from the African nation. These specific files were materials that investigative teams devoted substantial time to properly locating and authentically confirming. The senator strolled closer to the television so he could explain precisely what the images were illustrating. The items presented here are classroom registrations from your former capital city created prior to your relocation to the United States. The forms document pupils right next to their guardians, and this section clearly shows a student registered under a highly similar name. The parental figures are documented as that specific father and his respective spouse. Further down in these identical logs, the man in question is registered as a pupil sharing those exact same guardian identities. The identical paternal figure and his partner are officially recorded for this boy's profile, too. He rotated his body to look straight at the sitting Congresswoman. Matching guardians and a shared residence implies that based on these foreign academy views, you and this man are relatives born to the same couple. The viewing crowd became entirely quiet. Incredibly, her own fans appeared deeply concerned while viewing paperwork that was difficult to quickly ignore. The veteran then brought out physical pictures, which instantly showed up on the broadcast monitors for everyone to see. The visuals obviously originated from many years past, displaying a little female child who was clearly the lawmaker standing beside a small male. The two kids were interacting happily in domestic portraits that heavily suggested they lived under the exact same residential roof. The visuals are personal portraits previously uploaded to internet networking platforms prior to being scrubbed when the initial controversies emerged. You and the man in question are shown as youngsters simultaneously existing within an identical kinship group and shared home environment. He presented additional proof, featuring captured images of digital platform comments that investigators successfully saved right before they were intentionally erased. The graphics contained messages from individuals seeming to be blood relatives, authored in two distinct languages, specifically calling the disputed man their sibling. The displayed updates were authored by your personal kin prior to the moment all related content was aggressively removed from the public web. Those relatives labeled him as your sibling. Your literal blood relations directly identified this specific man as your familial brother. The senator strolled back near his assigned seat, yet he decided against actually taking a resting position. He grabbed an additional piece of paperwork to directly discuss the actual terminology of the names. The individual's complete title holds a direct linguistic connection to your authentic birth identity. Your recognized legal moniker is what it is, though your given secondary titles during infancy included those specific African words. The disputed man features your paternal figure's exact designation, acting as both his primary and secondary identifying labels. Such a practice reflects a regional cultural custom wherein offspring permanently inherit their paternal guardian's exact given title. He allowed the accumulated documentation to heavily impact the room for a second prior to explaining the overarching hypothesis. This is the timeline researchers suspect occurred, and you should observe that every single detail I mention aligns flawlessly with the provided documents. The man arrived in the United States and desperately required legal residential standing, most notably a permanent worker visa. The individual was your sibling, yet he simply lacked the ability to secure proper documentation swiftly through solitary efforts. You possessed fully recognized national citizenship by that specific year, thus you wed him, formally uniting two blood relatives. You executed a federal deception to secure your sibling a residency permit via the established married partner entry pathway. The chronological sequence popped onto the monitor, and the veteran explained it as though recounting a criminal tale instead of merely reciting a list. During that winter, you wed him, and he subsequently applies for long-term domestic standing under the guise of being your husband. Over the following 8 years, he solidifies his residency and builds a routine in this country utilizing your formal union as his base. A decade later, after he becomes fully settled and possesses a guaranteed permanent visa, you officially dissolve the marital contract. The next year, you formally wed another individual whom you were genuinely dating the entire time and who biologically sired your offspring. The speaker then retrieved the highly destructive proof, which consisted of financial revenue documents displaying combined household reporting. However, this specific part highlights where the situation becomes incredibly illegal and deceptive. Throughout the lengthy period you stayed officially wed to the first man, you simultaneously submitted combined federal tax documents alongside the second man. You maintained two different spouses for financial reporting reasons, constituting monetary deception layered directly over your previous border manipulation. He displayed the official conclusions from the Midwestern States Electoral Funding Oversight Committee. The regional government researched the matter, discovered broken rules, and penalized you several $1,000s. You settled the financial penalty, acting as a clear confession that errors existed within your revenue reporting throughout your union with the man. The Republican senator stepped much nearer to the representative's designated seating area. She remained entirely motionless, completely incapable of formulating a solid counterargument to combat the verified paperwork and historical files. Therefore, I plan to question you plainly on widespread broadcast networks while countless citizens observe and while these documents are totally visible. Is this specific individual your biological sibling? The severe inquiry lingered heavily in the room while every single person anticipated a response. This represented the ultimate crucial turning point. The Congresswoman's complexion reddened significantly while she glanced toward her political aides in the shadows before returning her gaze to the veteran. The moment she eventually opened her mouth to talk, she failed to provide an actual reply. These repulsive attacks are based entirely on religious hatred and racial prejudice, and authorities have previously reviewed and disproven them. That response completely avoids the question, the veteran stated, interrupting her sentence using a remarkably firm and uncompromising vocal tone. I proposed a very basic inquiry requiring a simple affirmative or negative reply. Is this particular individual genuinely your biological male sibling? I refuse to honor such a ridiculous question by giving you a factual statement. The senator's vocal pitch utilized the authoritative inflection that military personnel master, demanding to know if the man was her relative. The lawmaker declined to reply and shifted toward criticizing the inquiry itself as a highly prejudiced attack. She labeled the collected documentation as completely forged and described the entire investigative effort as deep-seated intolerance. The veteran allowed her to stop speaking, subsequently giving his counter-argument softly yet with absolute unyielding resolve. You refuse to state the negative, and that remains the crucial detail every viewer truly needs to comprehend tonight. I absolutely never proposed a highly difficult legislative or political inquiry. I question whether one distinct person was your sibling, and you entirely declined to answer with a denial. He pointed his hand toward the bright television monitor that continued displaying the controversial paperwork. Assuming these foreign educational documents are incorrect, please clarify exactly why they are flawed. Supposing these visuals do not feature your relatives, politely explain which household they actually depict. If your own kin were spreading falsehoods when labeling him a sibling, inform the audience regarding their motivation. If his title matching your paternal figure's moniker is merely a random chance, please elaborate on that unlikely randomness. The Republican representative strolled steadily toward the middle of the broadcasting platform. However, you clearly refused to provide a logical explanation for a single detail. You simply label every individual who poses a critical inquiry as a prejudiced bigot. You refuse to reject the claim that he serves as your biological male relative. You decline to submit to genetic medical testing to verify that he is unrelated. You merely aggressively criticize any person who dares to examine the presented factual documents. He rotated his stance to look right at her while preparing to deliver his final summary. I deployed to the Middle East, acting as an active member of the American Armed Forces. I swore a solemn pledge to protect this great republic and uphold its legal statutes. I entered combat to ensure the safety of our national boundaries and our naturalization framework. You potentially executed border deception and wed your literal sibling just to secure him a residency permit. You broke national legislation and cheated the exact safety network that rescued you from Africa, and currently you sit in the federal legislature. His concluding sentence was spoken with a highly subdued yet incredibly fierce level of passion. Assuming the man is not your sibling, provide the necessary evidence to confirm that claim. Submit to a scientific genetic screening and display the verified laboratory conclusions for the entire nation. Publish all of your comprehensive naturalization and border entry files immediately. Yet you refuse because it is impossible, and your quiet evasion provides the public with all the necessary information. The observing crowd exploded with noise. Surprisingly, a few of the lawmaker's followers appeared deeply disturbed by her stubborn unwillingness to just reject the claim. The wedding documentation, educational logs detailing identical guardians, and the domestic pictures felt incredibly difficult to overcome. She completely refused to reject the premise or submit herself to a medical genetics evaluation. Type out the word deception if you strongly desire a formal legal inquiry into this situation. The veteran refused to grant her a moment to regroup or reestablish her familiar story of being unfairly persecuted. He had already begun removing his subsequent organized binder from the stack. The television monitors transitioned to display a specific calendar day that every single viewer instantly understood, the 11th day of September during the year 2001. I was a 17-year-old teenager on that terrible morning. The senator started speaking softly, causing the studio to hush. The topic felt deeply intimate. It occurred during my final term of secondary education located in a Midwestern manufacturing town. I observed the television broadcast similar to most citizens and witnessed the subsequent aircraft strike happen in real time. I viewed the skyscrapers collapse and observed innocent folks leaping from flaming structures since remaining indoors guaranteed a fiery death. He stopped speaking momentarily, and within that silence existed a collective recollection that countless citizens across the country held deeply. I joined the military partially due to that catastrophic morning. I clearly comprehended our nation suffered an assault and hostile extremists declared combat operations against the Republic. I understood we possessed an obligation to fiercely retaliate. I traveled to the Middle East, operated within a hostile region, and fulfilled my duties during a conflict initiated because 19 attackers slaughtered almost 3,000 citizens that dawn. The veteran raised his gaze from his written materials and stared directly at the representative. Therefore, we should examine exactly how you characterized that early September tragedy. The broadcast monitor displayed the lawmaker attending a public advocacy gathering during the spring of 2019. She was talking informally, almost flippantly, regarding constitutional freedoms and minority demographic protections. Then arrived the specific phrase that permanently cemented her reputation for severe callousness. An advocacy group emerged following the tragedy since they observed a few individuals taking action and noticed our broader population gradually losing fundamental legal privileges. The senator repeated just that isolated fragment regarding folks doing things. He allowed the audio recording to loop a second time. A few individuals took certain actions, played once again. The constant echoing made the statement appear significantly more insensitive than upon the initial listen. The veteran retrieved a printed document, yet he avoided reciting it like a sterile index. He chose to narrate individual tragedies instead. A 32-year-old man was employed at a financial firm located on the upper levels of the southern skyscraper. He contacted his parent early that dawn, but she only listened as the connection suddenly dropped dead. His physical remains were absolutely never retrieved from the debris. He waited a moment prior to speaking again. A 54-year-old corporate executive functioning as a parent and spouse was managing his duties inside the high-rises that morning. He does not represent a random individual who simply experienced an event. He suffered a brutal homicide. He was slaughtered by radicalized violent extremists. The speaker proceeded with additional identities, avoiding a robotic recitation, treating each as a unique human catastrophe. A 49-year-old woman named Marie, a 37-year-old male employee working for an investment group, a 40-year-old financial staffer operating within the same company. He raised his head from the printed document. These merely represent the initial 5 victims listed in alphabetical order. They constitute the first handful out of nearly 3,000 citizens who suffered brutal assassinations. They absolutely do not represent generic folks who simply experienced random actions. They were slaughtered by foreign radicals who commandeered aircraft and piloted them directly into structures packed with blameless civilians. His vocal tone shifted from listing identities into something carrying genuine, deep-seated fury. Over 300 metropolitan emergency responders charged straight into those flaming skyscrapers. They climbed up the steps while the vast majority of people rushed downward. They understood the structures could potentially crumble, yet they proceeded forward regardless. They perished when they were violently crushed beneath countless tons of twisted metal and heavy masonry. These heroes were not simply individuals taking minor actions. These were incredibly brave people sacrificing their own existence to save complete strangers. He withdrew physical images from the attacks displaying the flaming skyscrapers. Citizens coated in gray dust escaping the destruction were documented in sequential frames. Emergency personnel were shown entirely trapped beneath the shattered masonry. The visual evidence was emotionally devastating, leaving the broadcast studio entirely speechless. I operated alongside service members who enlisted strictly due to those events. These men witnessed those buildings crumble and declared that their homeland faced an assault they needed to repel. Several of those brave individuals failed to return stateside. They perished overseas while combating the exact same brand of radical extremism that slaughtered civilians on that fateful dawn. The veteran pivoted his body to gaze at the lawmaker. And you referred to that massive tragedy as a situation where folks merely did things. You conversed as though the event resembled a minor traffic citation. You behaved like the catastrophic disaster constituted an insignificant, trivial occurrence. You talked as if the most horrific, violent assault occurring on domestic soil represented a basic, everyday happening. The lawmaker attempted to justify her phrasing, arguing the excerpt was stripped of context and maliciously weaponized. Absolutely no situational background exists that justifies such a statement. His voice elevated into a loud shout. There is zero context where labeling a massive slaughter as folks doing things is ever permissible. You refused to utilize the term terrorists. You neglected to say foreign extremists. You avoided terms like assault, homicide, or brutal massacre, opting instead to claim individuals merely acted. He broadcasted segments of her justifying the remark whenever people leveled criticisms against her. She completely refused to issue a formal apology. She neglected to offer any clarifying details regarding her intent. She simply asserted that the public was maliciously distorting her phrasing and unjustly targeting her character. You absolutely never expressed regret or admitted you should have been more articulate and respectful toward the casualties. You merely lashed out at any individual who felt insulted by your extreme downplaying of their monumental grief. The veteran stepped closer to the middle of the platform, carrying the heavy burden of his armed service within his physical posture. This nation provided you shelter when your African homeland became far too hazardous. When your own government failed to ensure your safety, you traveled here seeking refuge. Subsequently, 19 radicals assaulted this republic and slaughtered almost 3,000 civilians. You remain entirely incapable of accurately defining the horrific events that transpired. You refuse to properly respect the deceased individuals. You cannot even label the horrific occurrence as an act of radical violence. He allowed that heavy reality to settle completely before he resumed speaking. I donned the camouflage uniform and entered the subsequent conflict triggered by that tragic dawn. I suffered the loss of comrades who permanently remained overseas, yet you consistently belittle their ultimate dedication. You minimize the catastrophic assault that initiated the entire global conflict. You downplay nearly 3,000 slaughtered citizens as simply being victims of individuals acting. The senator returned to his designated seat and issued his ultimate concluding judgment. He took his position, staring straight at the controversial lawmaker. That behavior is not merely highly insulting. That attitude is not simply deeply insensitive to the public. That mindset represents absolute disdain. It signifies a profound contempt directed toward the United States. It embodies disrespect for the deceased casualties and every individual who served and sacrificed for the Republic. You remain unable to adequately respect the populace when violent radicals murder them. That failure completely eliminates your eligibility to advocate for citizens within the federal legislature. The quiet atmosphere that emerged afterward felt intensely profound. Even the lawmaker's dedicated followers failed to locate a reasonable justification for her spoken phrasing. The defining proof was her personal vocal recording significantly downplaying a massive slaughter. Almost 3,000 murdered citizens were casually dismissed as victims of folks taking action. She entirely refused to offer a genuine apology. Distribute this message if you recall your exact location on that terrible morning. The senator quickly advanced to his subsequent line of questioning. He offered the representative zero opportunity to recover or reestablish her familiar defensive posture. We need to discuss racial hatred directed at Jewish individuals. Your extreme prejudice against the Jewish community remains so glaring and repulsive that your personal political organization felt obligated to officially denounce your actions. Your own liberal colleagues, not conservative opponents, executed this action on two separate occasions. The television monitor presented the formal legislative document enacted during the spring of that specific year. The representative attempted to interject with her typical argument regarding foreign policy critiques lacking discriminatory intent. The senator projected his voice loudly over her interruptions. This conversation does not involve Middle Eastern government policies. This involves you broadcasting historical prejudice stereotypes designed to excuse brutal actions against Jewish populations over many centuries. Allow me to display for the audience the exact phrasing you utilized. The broadcast screens populated with the lawmaker's digital network publications. The veteran recited them aloud as if relaying a casual conversation rather than reading an official document. During the winter of that year, an individual questioned your thoughts on why domestic leaders backed the Middle Eastern ally. Your published response claimed the motivation was entirely centered around monetary currency. You punctuated the statement by attaching a graphical icon depicting a sack of cash. He permitted that offensive comment to linger in the studio for a brief period. You are suggesting that Jewish individuals purchase legislative backing using vast financial resources. You insinuate that domestic elected officials solely protect the allied nation because Jewish donors compensate them to act accordingly. You propose that the Jewish community secretly dictates government policy using massive wealth. That represents the absolute defining standard of anti-Jewish discrimination. The concept of Jewish populations covertly managing society via riches constitutes historical fascist propaganda, Representative. The subsequent digital post emerged, and the veteran recited it utilizing an identical measured cadence. During the late fall of 2012, you published a highly controversial digital update. You stated that the allied nation had mesmerized the entire globe, praying a deity would rouse the public to recognize the alleged wickedness of the country. The senator lifted his eyes away from the broadcast screen. Mesmerized the entire globe, he repeated with disgust. You are implying that Jewish populations possess supernatural abilities to manipulate and entrance the public mind. You assert they intentionally blind the global population to their supposed maliciousness. That represents another historical prejudice stereotype heavily featured within infamous discriminatory literature. That document remains one of the most hateful texts ever published regarding the demographic. He displayed additional posts where she equated the Allied democracy to historical fascist regimes. She implied that Jewish citizens harbored divided loyalties between two nations. She broadcasted unfounded rumors regarding the overarching influence of the Jewish community. This does not represent a valid critique of foreign governmental administration. This constitutes the active dissemination of extreme hostility toward Jewish individuals. You are deploying the exact vocabulary and identical stereotypes leveraged to oppress this demographic for hundreds of years. The veteran retrieved the formal legislative documents and explained their significance instead of merely projecting them visually. Your personal political faction felt so deeply ashamed that they executed a maneuver the legislature rarely attempts. They enacted a formal decree specifically addressing your controversial public commentary. The resolution passed during the spring witnessed the legislative body formally denouncing religious prejudice triggered directly by your digital posts. He presented the final voting tally to the audience. The final count stood at 407 against 23. It represented a nearly complete, unified consensus. Liberals and conservatives joined forces to officially condemn your published statements. Your personal faction's leadership hierarchy all cast ballots to denounce the phrasing you utilized. The senator hesitated briefly before delivering the most devastating blow. Following that event, you repeated the exact same behavior. You simply lacked the ability to restrain your offensive commentary. You published additional discriminatory remarks, forcing the body to denounce your actions a second time. The subsequent formal decree appeared on the screen, dated several months after the initial rebuke. This represented the secondary legislative action occurring a mere 16 weeks following the first instance. Your personal political organization felt compelled to formally reprimand you twice within 4 months for expressing Jewish hostility. When has such a phenomenon ever occurred regarding any sitting legislative member? He allowed that rhetorical inquiry to hang suspended without an answer before he proceeded. You cast a ballot opposing financial resources for the regional missile defense grid. That represents the protective network guarding innocent civilians from incoming extremist artillery strikes. You served as one of a mere 9 elected officials who rejected the measure. You were absolutely not rejecting funding for aggressive military hardware or offensive operations. You were specifically voting against shielding unarmed civilians from radicalized violent assaults. The senator's vocal tone shifted back to that intense military resonance. I operated alongside Jewish service members during my deployments. They represented several of the most courageous individuals I have ever encountered in my life. I spilled blood beside those men and placed my mortal existence entirely in their capable hands. Yet you broadcast malicious rumors regarding Jewish populations, dominating global affairs using massive wealth. He stepped significantly nearer to her seating position. You endorse an economic strategy that promotes financial warfare against the sole democratic state located in that region. You compare the allied nation to historically segregated governments. You reject every single legislative effort designed to bolster the allied state's defensive capabilities. You align yourself with radical militant organizations rather than supporting a democratic partner. The ultimate judgment arrived laced with undeniable, authentic revulsion. Your own liberal colleagues formally denounced you twice, not your conservative rivals who naturally oppose you. Your personal faction's leadership felt so incredibly mortified by your prejudice, they passed formal decrees issuing reprimands. That illustrates exactly how severe your hatred toward the Jewish community truly is. The veteran returned to his chair, successfully solidifying his argument using the opposition party's own disciplinary actions. You cannot conceal your behavior behind foreign policy critiques when you broadcast the exact discriminatory stereotypes utilized by historical fascist regimes. When your personal political organization formally denounces you on 2 occasions, that stops being a legislative debate and becomes pure intolerance. Her personal political faction officially reprimanded her discriminatory actions twice through formal legislative decrees. The final tally proved to be highly lopsided against her favor. Drop a comment acknowledging her prejudice if you recall these events occurring. The senator seized his subsequent file, causing the broadcast monitor to display a corporate emblem. We should now evaluate currency, specifically electoral donations flowing directly into your spouse's business enterprise. The individual's identity manifested on the display, subsequently trailed by his specific consulting agency's title. Following that, a figure materialized that caused the entire studio to collectively gasp in shock. $2,800,000 was the exact amount. Your partner operates a strategic political advisory corporation established a few years ago. Since that time frame, your electoral operation has compensated his business roughly almost $3 million. The veteran permitted that staggering sum to linger before he proceeded with his narrative. However, we must review the exact circumstances surrounding how this man became your legally wedded partner. That specific tale includes infidelity, a pair of shattered marriages, and massive amounts of donor cash moving throughout the entire ordeal. He extracted legal separation paperwork and explained it like a chronological record of disgrace. A few years ago, the man remained legally wedded to his previous spouse while his firm began assisting your electoral efforts. You maintained a legal union with a different man during this exact same period. The consultant's business secured the contract and financial compensation commenced transferring immediately. The chronological sequence materialized on the display, yet the senator recounted it as a narrative rather than reciting bulleted facts. During the late summer, the man's wife submitted legal paperwork to dissolve their marital union. Within the official court documents, she levied a highly specific accusation against him. She stated that the defendant's recent extensive travel and prolonged office hours seemed heavily connected to an improper romance with the representative. The veteran presented the genuine legal filing featuring that exact paragraph clearly highlighted for the audience. She firmly asserts her legally wedded partner engaged in an illicit relationship with you. She argues his professional transit for your electoral campaign served merely as a disguise for the infidelity. This information exists within formal judicial records submitted under the penalty of perjury. The sequence of events continued progressing. During the fall, you dissolved your marriage with your third husband. Less than 60 days following that event, photographers captured images of you alongside the consultant. By the spring of the next year, you formally wed the man. The veteran strolled toward the middle of the broadcasting platform. To briefly recap, the man contracted with your electoral operation, and you initiated a romance while both remained wed to separate individuals. His former spouse initiated a legal separation, directly referencing your illicit relationship in the paperwork. Both of you divorced your previous partners, and subsequently you married one another. Throughout this entire process, your electoral operation continued funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to his corporate entity. He extracted the financial transaction logs and detailed exactly what they represented. Transit accommodations, advisory charges, digital media creation, and online planning were heavily documented throughout the paperwork. Almost $3 million in total compensation was transferred to your new husband's business entity. This represented currency gathered from electoral contributors and everyday citizens offering minor donations, which ended up lining your partner's wallet. The Midwestern state's official investigative conclusions materialized on the broadcast screen. The Regional Electoral Oversight Committee examined the situation, identified broken regulations, and issued a penalty. They enforced the most massive financial punishment ever directed at a current legislative member at that specific time. The fine amounted to several $1,000s, and you ultimately submitted the payment. Submitting that payment serves as a direct confession that inappropriate activities occurred. The senator's vocal tone transitioned into authentic blue-collar indignation. I was raised in a highly impoverished mountainous region where my relatives battled financial ruin and substance abuse. We lacked wealthy networks or substantial financial resources during my upbringing. We were forced to labor intensely to improve our standing via military service and higher education. You arrived in this nation as a displaced person possessing absolutely nothing. Inexplicably, you currently possess massive amounts of wealth and luxury. You are compensating your partner with millions in electoral funds, utilizing contributor cash to financially boost your own household. He rotated his body to gaze right at the representative. The Federal Oversight Commission has acquired numerous grievances claiming you improperly leverage electoral cash for private advantages. They assert you actively funnel contributor funds back to yourself via your partner's corporate entity. That behavior remains entirely unlawful and completely lacks any ethical foundation. That constitutes financial theft accompanied by official documentation. His final judgment arrived paired with that trademark military bluntness. You entered the United States possessing absolutely zero assets. This republic provided you with incredible chances for success. You currently utilize those opportunities to pilfer from the electoral contributions of everyday laborers to financially elevate your husband. You leverage your position to compensate your own relatives using donor funds. That behavior absolutely does not represent honorable civic duty. That behavior constitutes blatant administrative corruption. Almost $3 million transferred to your partner's business while you engaged in an illicit romance with him. The Midwestern state's most massive financial penalty was successfully levied against you. Drop a comment acknowledging the deceit if you recognize the obvious truth. The senator retrieved recorded media clips displaying clear, visible eagerness. This specific evidence was poised to damage her political standing incredibly severely. During the late summer of 2 years prior, you traveled to your African homeland's capital city. You delivered a speech to massive crowds of citizens residing there. Would you like to view exactly what you stated to those individuals? The monitor displayed the lawmaker overseas, clothed in customary regional garments. She was addressing an energetic audience with intense passion, utilizing her native linguistic tongue. Translated text emerged at the bottom of the screen, clarifying her spoken phrasing. Instruct the public to question our true national origins. The veteran commanded the broadcast team to replay the specific clip. Instruct the public to question our true national origins. He ordered it to play a final time. Instruct the public to question our true national origins. The constant echoing rendered her underlying message absolutely impossible to misinterpret. You directed crowds overseas to aggressively question your actual patriotic allegiance. You avoided stating you served as a domestic legislator representing a Midwestern state. You neglected to mention you labor for the United States within the federal government. You instructed the crowd to inquire about your true homeland. He hesitated momentarily before proposing the most logical subsequent inquiry. Therefore, I must ask you right now, which nation do you actually hail from? The lawmaker tried to deliver a convoluted response regarding expatriate populations, cross-border identities, and preserving ancestral ties. Just answer the basic inquiry, the veteran interjected sharply. Which nation do you actually represent? She proved completely incapable of offering a straightforward answer, pledging loyalty to the Republic. She continued babbling regarding existing within two distinct cultures, advocating for immigrant demographics, and comprehending their specific viewpoints. She remains unable to utter the name of this republic, the senator noted in a hushed tone. You simply cannot state that you originate from this nation or hold it as your primary allegiance. You remain entirely unable to distinctly articulate where your genuine loyalty truly resides. He extracted the official sworn pledge of office and recited it, possessing the solemnity of an individual who respected such vows deeply. I solemnly swear to uphold and protect the foundational legal document of this republic against all adversaries, foreign and domestic. I pledge to maintain absolute faith and loyalty to that exact same document. He raised his eyes to meet hers. Loyalty directed exclusively toward the United States, not your former homeland or any other sovereign territory. That represents the exact commitment you made upon assuming your legislative position. The veteran placed the printed vow onto the table and spoke from his own intimate background. I accepted that exact same pledge when I enlisted in the armed forces. I genuinely meant every single syllable I uttered. I stood completely prepared to sacrifice my mortal existence to uphold it. I operated within a highly dangerous Middle Eastern combat sector during my deployment. That demonstrates exactly what genuine loyalty to this republic actually resembles in practice. He rotated his stance to look straight at the lawmaker. You swore the exact same vow upon taking office, yet you travel overseas and remain incapable of clearly identifying as a citizen of this nation. You instruct crowds to question your true patriotic origins during your public addresses. You actively advocate for the interests of your former homeland within your public speeches. Her legislative balloting history materialized on the display, and the senator explained the overarching trend. You cast ballots opposing domestic priorities on a remarkably consistent basis. You vote against denouncing radical militant factions operating overseas. You reject measures designed to back our primary democratic ally in the region. You oppose implementing financial embargoes against hostile foreign regimes. You vote against critical defensive initiatives necessary for national security. You continuously align yourself with sovereign states and organizations that remain openly aggressive toward this republic. He stepped much nearer to her position. I served a single nation and wore a solitary national banner upon my combat uniform. I engaged in warfare for one specific country, the United States. Who exactly are you laboring for, considering your overseas addresses, your balloting history, and your stubborn refusal to prioritize this republic? All of these actions provoke incredibly severe concerns regarding your true motivations. The senator's vocal tone grew significantly harsher and more unforgiving. I possess fallen comrades resting eternally within the National Military Cemetery. Those men represent armed service members who perished while protecting this exact country. They clearly comprehended which sovereign state they dedicated their lives to serving. They sacrificed absolutely everything for the United States, whereas you occupy a highly powerful seat in the legislature. You swore the exact same vow, yet you remain incapable of clearly articulating that you prioritize this nation above all others. His concluding judgment landed with catastrophic, devastating force. This republic rescued you from a collapsed African state. This country provided you everything your former homeland failed to offer, including security, schooling, citizenship, and a legislative career. You travel back to your birthplace and simply refuse to clearly identify yourself as a loyal citizen of this republic. The ultimate sentence was delivered quietly but carried an air of absolute, undeniable finality. Perhaps you are currently advocating on behalf of the incorrect sovereign territory. You directed crowds overseas to question your true national allegiance. You completely declined to state you primarily identified as a citizen of this country. A deployed veteran questions exactly where her true patriotic dedication actually lies. Distribute this message widely among your peers. The senator retrieved his ultimate piece of documented proof right before reaching the dramatic climax. The evidence consisted of recorded visual media captured during a previous interview session. This footage displays you conversing about a university academic program. Observe exactly how you behave whenever violent extremism is brought up in conversation. The video started rolling for the studio audience. An academic instructor or journalist referenced specific radical factions while discussing how the syllabus characterized them. As each distinct title was verbalized, the lawmaker utilized her fingers to create exaggerated, mocking quotation marks in the air. She wore a highly dismissive, sarcastic facial expression while performing the gesture. This behavior heavily implied that categorizing these specific organizations as violent extremists was somehow debatable or inaccurate. The veteran commanded the broadcast team to replay the clip twice without offering any immediate verbal commentary. The sarcastic finger gestures were incredibly obvious to every single viewer watching the broadcast. They appeared so unbelievably dismissive of the severity of the topic. The recorded actions essentially communicated their own horrific message without requiring additional explanation. I completed a tour in the Middle East, the senator commenced as the recording concluded. His vocal pitch remained low but carried an incredibly fierce intensity. I entered combat opposing the exact same brand of violent radicalism those specific organizations embody. I witnessed the horrific actions committed by extremists from a very close vantage point. I suffered the loss of comrades due to hidden explosives, surprise attacks, and radical individuals detonating themselves. Service members failed to return stateside specifically because of the exact ideological beliefs those groups actively broadcast. He paused momentarily, successfully cementing his authority regarding this subject via his own genuine lived experiences prior to proceeding. And you utilize sarcastic finger gestures as though these factions do not actually represent genuine extremist organizations. You behave as if their classification as violent radicals remains an open, debatable topic. The casualty statistics materialized on the broadcast monitor, and the veteran recited the figures purely from his own recollection. Radicals slaughtered almost 3,000 citizens during the early September tragedy. They forcefully commandeered 4 large commercial aircraft mid-flight. They piloted those planes directly into the massive metropolitan skyscrapers and the national military headquarters. They attempted to strike either the executive mansion or the primary legislative building in the capital. They only faltered because courageous civilians violently resisted on the final aircraft. His vocal volume increased significantly. Armed service members I operated alongside deployed to that conflict specifically due to the actions committed by those exact radicals. Several of those men remain deceased today due to the violence perpetrated by extremists, and you utilize sarcastic finger gestures, heavily implying they do not genuinely qualify as violent radicals. He presented the historical link regarding the secondary militant faction mentioned in the clip. That specific organization slaughtered over 200 armed service members stationed in the Middle East decades ago. The attack involved a massive explosive device loaded into a large transport vehicle. Service members resting inside their designated living quarters were brutally assassinated by extremists while actively serving their republic. The veterans strolled purposefully toward the lawmakers' designated seating area, and you utilize sarcastic finger gestures, heavily implying that the faction does not truly represent an extremist network. He consolidated the entire established trend regarding her public remarks and legislative balloting history. You severely downplay the September tragedy by calling it a situation where folks merely did things. You utilize sarcastic finger gestures when discussing notorious, globally recognized radical factions. You cast ballots opposing essential legislative measures designed to combat violent extremism. You actively resist formally classifying highly dangerous militant networks as terrorist organizations. You consistently offer defensive arguments for sovereign territories known to finance radical violence. The overall behavioral trend remains incredibly obvious to anyone paying attention. The subsequent inquiry arrived carrying intense, unforgiving military severity. I engaged in combat against violent radicals, whereas you constantly manufactured justifications for their horrific behavior. I require a basic response. Does that specific network qualify as a violent extremist organization? Affirmative or negative? The lawmaker proved utterly incapable of providing a basic affirmative reply to the direct inquiry. She began detailing situational background, international administrative strategies, unintended consequences, and geopolitical nuances. Affirmative or negative, the veteran aggressively demanded, utilizing that authoritative vocal pitch once again. Does that specific network genuinely qualify as a violent extremist organization? She continued avoiding the direct question, stubbornly declining to provide a straightforward answer. The senator permitted her ongoing evasion to serve as its own devastating condemnation. You remain utterly incapable of plainly labeling these individuals as violent extremists. You simply cannot denounce the exact network responsible for slaughtering almost 3,000 domestic citizens. You remain unable to properly respect the armed service members who perished while combating those exact forces. His final judgment proved completely absolute and entirely uncompromising in its delivery. I swore a solemn pledge to protect this republic against all hostile adversaries. You accepted that exact same vow, yet you appear entirely uncertain regarding the true identity of our enemies. That mindset is not merely incorrect, it represents a massive, terrifying hazard. Such an attitude completely eliminates your eligibility to manage national defense protocols or advocate for citizens in any official capacity. A deployed combat veteran inquires if she believes the network represents an extremist faction, and she refuses to confirm it. She utilized sarcastic finger gestures when discussing violent radicals during a recorded interview session. Distribute this completely disgraceful behavior widely among your peers. The senator rose from his seat and strolled toward the middle of the platform to deliver his ultimate concluding remarks. He purposely abandoned his organized binders and physical evidence upon his designated table. This final address would originate purely from deep personal conviction and lived memory rather than scripted notes. I desire to establish absolute clarity regarding one specific point before we conclude this broadcast tonight. I genuinely believe every single citizen observing this event must comprehend the true core of this entire discussion. What exactly represents the fundamental issue at the center of this debate? He hesitated momentarily, collecting his internal thoughts or perhaps managing his rising emotional state. I was 17 years old when the September tragedy occurred on domestic soil. I observed those massive skyscrapers crumble to the ground in real time. I clearly understood our republic was enduring a massive coordinated assault. I enlisted in the armed forces specifically because I desired to serve the nation that granted my relatives a chance at success. This republic provided us an opportunity when we were battling severe poverty and hardship. His vocal tone completely conveyed the heavy burden of his military deployment. I deployed to the highly dangerous Middle Eastern combat sector. I witnessed my close comrades suffer severe physical injuries during engagements. I watched several of those men fail to ever return stateside. I fulfilled my obligations in protecting this republic against the exact same brand of radicalism that slaughtered almost 3,000 civilians on that specific Tuesday morning. That demonstrates exactly what respecting the sworn pledge genuinely looks like in reality. That represents the true, authentic meaning of pledging loyalty to the United States. He walked several paces forward, then rotated his body to face the representative directly. You arrived in this country as a displaced person decades ago. You were a 12-year-old child escaping a collapsed African state plagued by extreme brutality and severe famine. Your relatives escaped, and this republic provided you with safe harbor. This nation granted you security when your own homeland completely failed to protect your existence. It provided you with schooling, legal residency, and incredible chances for advancement. You eventually transformed into a federal legislator representing citizens across the country. This serves as one of the most incredibly influential roles within the entire domestic administrative framework. The veteran allowed that profound reality to thoroughly settle into the room prior to proceeding. This republic provided you with absolutely everything, so permit me to detail exactly how you compensate for that incredible generosity. What immediately followed was a completely thorough denunciation delivered as a cohesive tale of treason rather than a mere list. You potentially executed a massive border deception by wedding your own biological sibling. The collected proof supporting this specific allegation remains incredibly difficult to overcome. Educational logs display identical guardians, domestic pictures show you cohabitating as kids, and kin label him a sibling. His actual title features your paternal figure's exact given moniker. You executed financial deception by submitting revenue paperwork alongside two different spouses simultaneously. You refuse to explicitly reject the claim that he serves as your biological brother. You decline to submit to medical genetic screening to prove your innocence. You remain unable to address the basic inquiry, instead choosing to label all questioners as prejudiced bigots. He transitioned to the subsequent act of betrayal. You severely downplayed the September tragedy, referring to it as folks merely doing things. This constituted the most horrific extremist assault occurring on domestic soil, resulting in almost 3,000 slaughtered citizens. I entered combat during the subsequent global conflict triggered by that exact morning. You remain utterly incapable of adequately respecting the deceased casualties of that event. You absolutely never expressed any genuine regret for your highly offensive phrasing. You aggressively defended your attempts to minimize the catastrophic nature of the massive slaughter. The third major betrayal involves you disseminating religious hatred so repulsive your own liberal colleagues formally denounced you twice. The legislature passed official decrees with a massively lopsided voting tally against your favor. Your personal political faction felt so deeply mortified, they felt compelled to officially reprimand your hostility toward Jewish individuals. You deployed historical prejudice stereotypes targeting the specific demographic. You conversed regarding Jewish populations covertly dominating society, utilizing vast financial resources. You discussed Jewish individuals possessing supernatural abilities to mesmerize the global population. This represents the exact same discriminatory vocabulary utilized by infamous historical fascist regimes. Fourthly, you transferred almost $3 million to your partner's corporate enterprise. You engaged in an illicit romance with him while both of you remained wedded to different spouses. You received the most massive electoral funding penalty ever issued by the Midwestern States Oversight Committee. You actively utilize contributor cash to financially elevate your own household. It represents blatant administrative corruption thinly veiled as professional consulting services. Fifthly, You traveled to your former homeland and instructed the crowd to question your true national origins. You remain utterly incapable of plainly identifying yourself as a loyal citizen of this republic. You absolutely refuse to state that you prioritize this nation above all others. You actively promote the specific geopolitical interests of your former homeland. You cast ballots opposing critical domestic legislative priorities on a remarkably consistent basis. Significant concerns exist regarding your divided allegiances, which you stubbornly refuse to adequately address. Sixthly, you utilize sarcastic finger gestures when discussing notorious radical factions. You remain unable to explicitly categorize those specific organizations as violent extremists. This represents the exact network responsible for slaughtering almost 3,000 domestic citizens. Armed service members similar to myself engaged in combat against those precise radical forces. You appear entirely unconvinced that these groups genuinely qualify as malicious entities. The senator ceased his pacing and planted himself firmly in the center of the broadcasting platform, staring right at the lawmaker. Both of us accepted sworn pledges to protect this republic and defend its foundational legal document against all adversaries. We formally vowed to maintain absolute faith and true patriotic allegiance. His vocal volume elevated with intense, undeniable conviction. I deeply respected that vow by serving in a highly dangerous combat sector. I stood entirely prepared to sacrifice my mortal existence on behalf of this nation. That demonstrates precisely what my sworn pledge truly signified to my personal character. He forcefully directed his index finger toward her seated position. You completely shattered that exact same solemn vow. You potentially cheated the entire national border entry framework by manipulating the system. You unquestionably disseminated intense hatred toward the Jewish community on multiple occasions. You undoubtedly utilized your influential position to aggressively enrich your own personal finances. You blatantly displayed deeper loyalty toward your former homeland rather than the republic you serve. You absolutely belittled the severity of radical violence and disrespected the domestic casualties who perished. The intimate nature of the confrontation fully materialized as he delivered a harsh assessment from one veteran to a civilian. I possess close comrades resting eternally at the National Military Cemetery. They represent armed service members who perished while protecting this specific republic. They treated their sworn pledges with the utmost severity and solemn respect. They sacrificed absolutely everything they possessed for the greater good of the nation. You disgrace their ultimate dedication by serving in the legislature while potentially operating as a border system fraudster. You are unquestionably an individual harboring intense religious prejudice against the Jewish community. You are undeniably engaging in deeply corrupt administrative practices. You obviously prioritize the interests of your former homeland far above the needs of this republic. The veteran stepped significantly nearer to her designated chair to issue his final concluding remarks. You arrived in this country possessing absolutely zero assets or resources. This republic provided you with incredible opportunities and massive success. You have dedicated your professional career to continuously criticizing and attacking this exact nation. You have spent your tenure potentially cheating the republic, disseminating hostility, enriching yourself, and advancing foreign priorities instead of domestic ones. He pivoted his body toward the broadcast lenses and the massive audience observing the event. Citizens require elected officials who genuinely adore this great republic. We require leaders who fulfill their duties with integrity and maintain their sworn pledges. We absolutely do not require an individual who potentially executed massive legal deception. We certainly do not require a representative who undeniably disseminated intense societal hatred. We absolutely do not require a politician who undeniably became corrupt and refuses to prioritize this nation. The veteran directed his focus back toward the lawmaker for his ultimate concluding sentence. I fulfilled my duties serving this republic, whereas you potentially cheated the entire system. That represents the massive, undeniable distinction separating our two individual characters. This nation genuinely requires a significantly higher quality of leadership than you currently provide. The resulting audience applause and cheering endured for 7 entire minutes. Chants promoting the nation blended with demands to investigate her actions and pursue legal incarceration. The sheer volume of the roaring crowd was incredibly deafening. Former armed service members seated within the studio stood rigidly at formal attention. A few of those veterans were actively rendering military salutes directed right at the senator. The lawmaker remained seated, utterly incapable of formulating any adequate counterargument. Every single accusation was supported by verifiable documentation and verified files. The matrimonial paperwork, educational logs detailing identical guardians, and her personal vocal recordings proved incredibly difficult to overcome. The formal legislative decrees, financial oversight penalties, and her overseas address were entirely authenticated. They remained completely impossible for anyone to reasonably dispute or deny. The standard defensive tactic claiming religious prejudice had utterly collapsed against a military man holding verified receipts. The broadcast recording accumulated nearly 200 million views within a single week. It quickly transformed into one of the most heavily observed political clashes in modern domestic history. However, the massive viewership represented only a minor fraction of the overarching consequences. Less than 2 days following the confrontation, federal investigative agencies encountered massive societal demands to probe the wedding deception claims. Conservative legislative members aggressively demanded explanations regarding why the accusations had previously evaded thorough examination. Right-leaning media networks broadcast extensive segments analyzing the documentation the senator had utilized. Even several traditional news organizations felt compelled to admit the paperwork appeared authentic and the inquiries were valid. The specific question regarding her brother's identity dominated digital trending topics for 14 consecutive days. Conservative advocacy networks launched massive initiatives demanding she submit to genetic screening to verify her innocence. The stark reality that she absolutely refused to deny the claim or undergo medical testing transformed into the primary narrative. Even impartial commentators pointed out that guiltless individuals typically just reject such severe accusations outright. Her own liberal political faction commenced retreating from her presence with remarkable swiftness, highlighting her toxic standing. The primary legislative leader completely declined to offer a defense when journalists questioned the situation. Another prominent leader issued vague remarks stating all elected officials must account for their own historical actions. The specific committee placements she heavily desired were immediately reassigned to different legislative members. Requests to attend exclusive political gatherings rapidly vanished without any explanation. Operating outside the public view, faction leaders clearly signaled she lacked any institutional backing or protection. The veteran demographic reacted with incredibly fierce and highly coordinated intensity. Organizations representing former service members that typically avoided electoral disputes launched massive initiatives demanding her legislative expulsion. Specific groups representing the exact branch the senator served in openly commended his willingness to pose difficult questions. The stark difference between a deployed combat veteran and a politician accused of cheating the system became a massive rallying cry. The domestic religious minority demographic she belonged to experienced severe internal division regarding the entire ordeal. Numerous individuals denounced the lawmaker, arguing she deeply humiliated their collective population and failed to advocate for them. Different legislative members sharing her faith actively retreated from her, with one explicitly stating her scandals belonged to her alone. A few individuals attempted to defend her by labeling the criticisms as prejudiced attacks, yet they failed to dismiss the documented proof. Half a year following the massive confrontation, a centrist liberal declared an electoral challenge targeting her specific Midwestern jurisdiction. His initial promotional broadcast prominently featured visual snippets of the senator's aggressive questioning. The video explicitly focused on the sibling matrimony accusations and the highly controversial overseas public address. His primary campaign motto heavily prioritized domestic interests rather than foreign priorities. His initial 7 days of financial soliciting generated over $4 million from contributors located across the republic. Public opinion surveys conducted within her geographic jurisdiction indicated her voter backing plummeted from 61% down to 38%. Her negative public perception metrics skyrocketed to an unprecedented 59%. The toxic blend of potential border deception, religious prejudice, financial misconduct, and questionable allegiance severely ruined her standing. This massive collapse occurred even within one of the most heavily liberal voting districts located in the entire nation. A full year after the intense broadcast confrontation, facing inevitable electoral failure and looming federal inquiries, she made a public declaration. The lawmaker formally announced she would absolutely not pursue another term serving in the federal legislature. Her official publication claimed she desired to concentrate on alternative methods of assisting her local population. However, every single person observing the situation clearly comprehended the genuine underlying reality of her departure. The veteran had completely dismantled her political career by posing inquiries she lacked the ability to properly address. He utilized verified documentation that she remained entirely incapable of reasonably refuting or dismissing. The military man successfully accomplished exactly what traditional journalism networks completely refused to ever attempt. He posed the incredibly awkward questions, displayed the highly uncomfortable documents, and aggressively demanded difficult answers. When the lawmaker attempted to shield herself behind claims of prejudice, his armed service record provided an impenetrable defensive barrier. Her usual evasive strategies completely failed to breach his established credibility and authoritative standing. This encounter did not represent a standard exchange of differing legislative ideologies or administrative strategies. This constituted a massive clash between a deployed combat veteran and an individual accused of cheating the very framework he protected. It represented an intense conflict contrasting verified military dedication against potential border entry deception. It served as a massive battle pitting a veteran's sworn pledge against a legislator's massive betrayal of public trust. The senator deployed a strategic weapon the lawmaker had absolutely never previously encountered during her career. He utilized factual documentation she proved unable to ignore, paired with a reputation she completely failed to effectively criticize. When she labeled the matrimony deception claims as prejudiced, he presented official municipal certificates and educational logs. Whenever she attempted to deploy tales of unjust persecution, he projected formal decrees where her own colleagues denounced her actions. When she criticized his underlying intentions, he simply referenced his active combat deployment located in the Middle East. Every single defensive maneuver she previously utilized with great success utterly collapsed against a veteran who adequately prepared his arguments. The collected documentation remained entirely impossible to successfully deny or wave away. Municipal certificates confirmed her legal union to the specific individual in question. Educational logs documented both individuals registered under the exact same paternal and maternal guardians. Domestic pictures displayed the two of them cohabitating as youngsters within a shared household environment. Her personal kin explicitly labeled him a sibling prior to the massive coordinated digital deletion effort. Financial revenue paperwork proved she submitted combined files alongside two distinct spouses simultaneously. Midwestern state findings thoroughly detailed her numerous administrative financial violations. Formal legislative decrees heavily denounced her extreme hostility toward Jewish communities on two separate occasions. Electoral funding paperwork documented millions of dollars transferring directly into her partner's corporate enterprise. Recorded media displayed her severely downplaying the catastrophic September tragedy occurring on domestic soil. Video captured her directing crowds overseas to aggressively question her true national origins. Her sarcastic finger gestures regarding notorious violent radical factions remained incredibly obvious to all viewers. Every single piece of evidence was heavily documented and completely authenticated by outside sources. All of the presented materials proved totally impossible to reject as mere unfounded rumors when broadcast on television. However, the absolute most destructive element involved the specific action she remained entirely incapable of performing. She found it impossible to plainly reject the claim that the individual served as her biological sibling. She completely declined to submit to a medical genetic evaluation to verify her innocence regarding the accusations. She remained unable to distinctly articulate that she prioritized this republic above all other global priorities. She proved incapable of labeling the notorious network as violent extremists without resorting to hesitation or excuses. Her continuous evasion and absolute silence communicated significantly more information than any direct allegation ever could. The senator successfully demonstrated that armed service grants an ethical credibility that completely overrides standard political sensitivities. He firmly proved that factual documentation effectively crushes false tales of unjust victimization. He demonstrated that posing difficult inquiries never constitutes prejudice whenever an individual holds the verified receipts. He further established that this republic desperately requires elected officials who adore the nation enough to protect it during combat. We absolutely do not require leaders who potentially cheated the system to import their personal relatives. Distribute this narrative widely if you genuinely believe the lawmaker requires a thorough federal investigation regarding border deception. Leave a supportive comment if you feel a deployed veteran rightfully earned the privilege to question suspected fraudsters. The senator posed the exact inquiries the domestic population desperately needed answered. He presented the factual documentation the traditional journalism networks completely refused to thoroughly analyze. He aggressively demanded accountability from a politician who utilized claims of prejudice as a shield for an extensive period. The verified receipts never broadcast falsehoods, and neither do deployed combat veterans.